Get out of my briefing room, Cole. Nobody called you. Dr. Raymond Hall didn't just say it. He pointed at the door. In front of every senior physician, every department head, every federal liaison in that room, and he waited. Waited for her to shrink. Waited for her to apologize. Waited for her to become exactly what he had always decided she was. Invisible, irrelevant, replaceable. Meredith picked up her folder. She walked out without a word. 48 hours later, 2 Black Hawk helicopters cut through the morning sky and hit the rooftop of Bethesda Regional with military precision. The lead agent stepped forward and spoke 4 words that stopped the entire hospital cold. "Where is Agent Cole?" If you are new here, please subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and follow this story all the way to the end, because what happens next will absolutely take your breath away. And drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. Meredith Cole arrived at Bethesda Regional Medical Center on a Tuesday morning in October, the same way she had arrived every morning for the past 3 years, quietly, precisely, and completely unnoticed. She clocked in at 6:58, 2 minutes before her shift technically required her presence. She changed into her scrubs in the locker room without engaging in the usual small talk. She checked the medication card inventory, updated 2 patient charts from the overnight rotation, and had already read through the morning briefing by the time most of her colleagues were still pouring their second cup of coffee. Nobody thanked her for any of it. That was fine. She had not expected them to. The nursing staff at Bethesda was a complicated ecosystem, the way most hospital environments were, full of unspoken hierarchies and invisible lines that nobody acknowledged, but everybody obeyed. There were nurses who had been there for 20 years and had turned their tenure into a kind of informal power, deciding who got the good assignments and who got stuck in the overflow. There were younger nurses, fresh out of their programs, who were still learning how much of medicine was politics and how little of it was actually science. And then there was Meredith. She occupied a space that was hard to describe because it required people to pay attention to her in order to define it. And paying attention to Meredith was something almost nobody at Bethesda seemed capable of doing. She was 41 years old, medium height, brown hair pulled back without ceremony. Her face was the kind of face that was easy to look past. Not plain, not striking, simply composed in a way that drew no particular reaction. She spoke when she needed to speak. She smiled when smiling was appropriate. She moved through the hospital corridors with a kind of fluid efficiency that spoke of someone who had long ago calculated the fastest route between every point A and every point B in a given space, and had simply memorized all of them. Her co-workers had a variety of opinions about her, most of which they had never bothered to share with her directly. Sandra Price, the charge nurse on the 3rd floor, who had been at Bethesda for 19 years and considered herself the unofficial arbiter of who mattered and who did not, had decided within the first 2 weeks of Meredith's arrival that the new nurse was odd. Not unfriendly. She was always clear to clarify that. Just odd. She kept to herself too much. She asked questions that felt like they were testing you somehow. She noticed things that other people didn't notice and then said nothing about them until suddenly she said something about them and it turned out she was right. And that was even more unsettling than if she had just been wrong. Marcus Webb, the day shift orderly who had a gift for reading people, and had once thought about going into psychology before life steered him elsewhere, had a different read on Meredith. He thought she was the most self-contained person he had ever met. Not cold, not arrogant, just complete. Like she had some internal architecture that didn't require external validation to remain standing. He found that quality fascinating and slightly humbling in equal measure, and because he didn't fully understand it, he kept a respectful distance. And then there was Dr. Raymond Hall, who had formed his opinion of Meredith Cole on approximately her 3rd day at Bethesda and had never once revisited it. Raymond Hall was the kind of man who had been handed authority before he had ever earned it. and the experience had taught him exactly the wrong lessons. He was 53, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, and possessed of the particular confidence that belongs to men who have spent their entire careers being told they were impressive. He had his medical degree, yes, but what he truly prided himself on was his administrative acumen, his ability to navigate the political landscape of hospital administration, to say the right things to the right people at the right moments, to position himself and his institution advantageously in every situation that mattered. He had been appointed Chief of Staff at Bethesda 11 months ago through a combination of professional maneuvering and personal connections that had very little to do with his clinical skills. He knew this. Somewhere deep beneath his polished exterior, he knew it. And that knowledge, buried and unexamined, expressed itself outward as a hair-triggered defensiveness about his authority that could ignite with almost no warning. Meredith had triggered it for the first time on day 3 by quietly pointing out during a staff meeting he was running that the visitor protocol he was describing had a gap in it that could create a liability issue. She had said it simply, without aggression, in the tone of someone noting a factual error. He had stared at her for a long, flat moment and then said, "I appreciate the input," in a voice that communicated precisely the opposite, and moved on. After the meeting, he had asked Sandra who that nurse was, and Sandra had told him, and he had filed the information in a mental folder labeled "Things to Keep an Eye On," and had kept his eye on it ever since. In the months that followed, Meredith had given him several more opportunities to decide he didn't like her. She submitted written observations about medication storage temperatures that were technically outside protocol. She flagged an inconsistency in the overnight security check procedure that she said created a window of unmonitored access to the pharmaceutical supply room. She recommended, in a quietly worded memo that somehow felt more pointed than shouting, that the East Corridor emergency exit should be equipped with an additional alarm because the current one had a documented delay in its response time. Each of these concerns was logged and then effectively buried. Raymond signed off on them the way administrators sign off on things they have no intention of pursuing, with a pen stroke that communicated finality rather than engagement. He told himself, and occasionally others, that Meredith Cole was a nurse who had an overinflated sense of her own expertise and an unfortunate tendency to reach beyond her lane. What he did not allow himself to consider, even for a moment, was the possibility that she might be right. It was the second week of October when everything shifted, though almost nobody understood what was happening or why. The first sign was the phones. Government phones, specifically, the kind with encryption features and federal exchange codes that the hospital's administrative staff recognized because Bethesda was, after all, a medical center with a long history of treating government personnel. But the volume of calls was unusual, and the nature of the calls was unusual. And the requests that came through those calls, quiet, precise, carefully worded requests for floor plans, staff rosters, patient census data, and infrastructure access documentation, were the kind of requests that made the hospital's compliance officer, a careful woman named Janet Cho, sit very still at her desk for a long moment before reaching for her own phone. By Thursday of that week, word had circulated among the senior staff that the hospital had been selected as a contingency medical facility for an upcoming presidential visit to the Washington metro area. The language used was contingency, which technically meant backup, which technically meant the president would likely never set foot inside the building. But Bethesda's administration treated the designation as though the president himself had personally chosen their institution as his preferred medical destination, and the resulting preparation effort had the energy of a full-scale mobilization. Raymond Hall was in his element. He held 3 meetings in 2 days, each one longer and more performatively serious than the last. He used phrases like operational security integration and coordinated federal civilian interface protocol, with the authority of someone who had invented those phrases personally. He assigned department heads to liaison roles. He ordered the facilities team to repaint the east lobby. He commissioned a new sign for the main entrance. He did not ask Meredith Cole for her input on any of it. He did not ask her for anything at all. Meredith, for her part, said very little. She attended the all-staff briefing on Friday morning and sat in the second row and listened with the particular quality of attention that was her trademark: total, unobtrusive, and somehow more thorough than the attentiveness of people who were visibly and vocally engaged. She watched Raymond pace the front of the conference room. She watched the facilities director nod along to things he clearly didn't understand. She watched her colleagues react to the excitement and the gravity of the situation with the mixture of pride and anxiety that major institutional events tend to produce. And she noticed things. She was always noticing things. She noticed that the briefing made no mention of the East Corridor emergency exit. She noticed that the revised access protocol being distributed applied only to the main entrance and the two secondary entrances, and said nothing about the service entrance on the building's north side, which she had personally confirmed was operable with a standard hospital master key that was not tracked or logged when issued. She noticed that the discussion of rooftop access, which came up briefly when someone asked about helicopter landing capability, was dismissed quickly when Raymond said that the rooftop was secured without specifying what that meant or who had verified it. After the briefing, she walked to Raymond's office. She knocked. She was told to come in. "Dr. Hall," she said, standing in the doorway with her hands at her sides, "I have a few concerns about the security preparation I'd like to walk you through." Raymond looked up from his desk with the expression of a man who had been interrupted doing something important by someone who was definitely not important. "Cole," he said, and the way he said her name had the quality of a sigh that had been compressed into two syllables. "We've had a comprehensive briefing. The federal security team is handling their side of things. We are handling ours. And I'm confident the process is..." "The service entrance on the north side," Meredith said, "is accessible with an untracked master key. There are currently 4 of those keys in circulation among facilities staff, and we have no logged record of where any of them are at any given time." Raymond set down his pen. "The service entrance is a facilities issue." "Yes, which is why I'm raising it now, before the federal team completes their assessment, so we can correct it before it becomes a problem they identify in our institution's security audit." The pause that followed lasted exactly long enough to contain the ghost of Raymond, considering whether she had a point, and then extinguishing that consideration entirely. "I'll flag it with facilities," he said, which was the administrative equivalent of putting something in a drawer and closing the drawer. "There's also the East Corridor exit," Meredith said. "Cole. The response delay on the secondary alarm is documented in 2 separate maintenance reports. If someone wanted to use that exit as..." "Cole." His voice had changed. It had dropped into a register that was meant to land like weight, meant to communicate that this conversation was over, not because it had concluded, but because he was ending it. "I appreciate your diligence. I do. But we have federal agents. We have our own security team. And we have protocols that have been reviewed at levels significantly above the nursing staff. Your concerns are noted. You are dismissed." She held his gaze for one beat. Just one. Then she nodded, and she left. In the hallway outside his office, she stopped, and she allowed herself exactly 10 seconds of something that was not quite frustration, and not quite grief, and not quite the particular exhaustion that comes from being right in a room full of people who will not hear you. Then she folded it up and put it away, the way she had learned to do a long time ago, in a completely different life, and she went back to work. Sandra caught her at the nurse's station 20 minutes later. "I heard you went to Hall," Sandra said, her voice carrying the particular note of warning that women who have learned to navigate certain environments use to signal to other women that they are about to walk into something they should probably avoid. "I raised some concerns," Meredith said, updating a chart without looking up. Honey, Sandra leaned on the counter. You have been here 3 years. In 3 years, have you ever once seen Raymond Hull change his mind because a nurse told him to? There's a first time for everything. No, there isn't. Sandra's voice was not unkind. It was the voice of someone who had made her peace with a certain reality a long time ago and was now, not without affection, trying to help someone else do the same. There is not a first time for everything. Some things are just the way they are. Meredith looked up then, and Sandra, who had worked alongside this woman for 3 years without ever quite feeling like she knew her, felt something strange pass through the moment, some quality of stillness in Meredith's expression that was both completely calm and deeply, undeniably certain. Someone is going to get hurt, Meredith said quietly, without drama, because of those access points. And I've put it on the record. That's what I can do. Sandra didn't have an answer for that. She straightened up and went back to her work. And the feeling that something important had just been said stayed with her for the rest of her shift in a way she couldn't quite explain. The weekend passed, Monday arrived, and with Monday came the federal advance team. They moved through the hospital in pairs, which was the first thing Meredith noticed. Pairs was not the standard configuration for a venue assessment. Standard was solo walkthroughs with coordinated check-ins. Pairs meant elevated concern. Pairs meant something had already been flagged, or something was expected to be flagged, and they wanted witnesses and redundancy at every moment of the process. The lead agent introduced himself to Raymond as Special Agent Thomas Garrett. He was perhaps 45, lean, with the kind of face that had been trained out of expressiveness so completely that reading it required a specific skill set. He shook Raymond's hand with the efficiency of someone who viewed handshaking as a data collection opportunity rather than a social ritual. And then he moved his eyes, briefly, quickly, almost imperceptibly, around the lobby, and Meredith, who was passing through on her way to the East Wing, saw him do it, and she understood exactly what she had just seen. He was not doing an initial scan. He was doing a confirmation scan. He had already seen the floor plans. He already had the layout in his head. He was checking whether what he was seeing matched what he had been told. And by the slight tightening around his eyes when he reached the East Corridor, she could tell that it didn't entirely. She kept walking. She did not stop. She did not look back. But she filed it away, the way she filed everything away, precisely, completely, in the kind of internal storage system that had been built not in nursing school, but somewhere much earlier, in a world most of the people in this hospital couldn't begin to imagine. That afternoon, Raymond called a secondary briefing for department heads only. Meredith was not a department head. She was not invited. She learned about it afterward from Marcus, who had overheard the tail end of it while collecting laundry from the conference room adjacent to where the meeting was held. Something about a credible concern, Marcus said, keeping his voice low as he rolled his cart past her station. I only caught pieces of it. Something about external intelligence. Something about the visit schedule being compressed. Meredith looked at him. Compressed how? Like moved up, like possibly happening sooner than announced. He glanced around. I probably wasn't supposed to hear any of that. You definitely weren't, Meredith agreed. Thank you, Marcus. He moved on. She stood still for a moment, and the arithmetic she was doing in her head was not the kind of arithmetic that had anything to do with medication dosages or patient schedules. She walked to the East Corridor. She walked to the emergency exit at the end of it. She put her hand on the push bar and applied exactly enough pressure to confirm what she already suspected, that the secondary alarm, the one with the documented response delay, was still operating on the original configuration. Nobody had changed it. Nobody had flagged it in the federal assessment, or if they had, the change order hadn't come through yet. She stood there with her hand on the push bar, and she thought very carefully for about 45 seconds. Then she went to find a pen, and she wrote a formal incident report, the kind with a specific procedure number and a required routing path. And she documented the East Corridor alarm delay in explicit technical detail. including the maintenance report numbers that supported the observation, and she hand-delivered it to the security office, bypassing Raymond's administrative chain entirely, because the routing protocol for a formal incident report technically allowed, in a clause most people had never read, direct submission to the facility security coordinator, which was a different position than the chief of staff. The security coordinator was a retired police officer named Bill Ferraro, who had been at Bethesda for 7 years and took his job with the serious plainness of someone who had never learned to make things more complicated than they needed to be. He read Meredith's report. He read it again. He looked up at her. "You're the one who flagged the service entrance last week too," he said. "Yes." He nodded slowly, the way men of his generation nodded when something had earned genuine consideration. "I'll get this to the federal team directly." "That would be the appropriate step," Meredith said. She left his office. She went back to her rounds. She administered medications, updated charts, spoke with 2 patients' families with the particular combination of warmth and clarity that she brought to those conversations, and responded to a minor incident in room 412 with the kind of calm, efficient problem-solving that made her colleagues grateful to have her present, even when they didn't think about why. By the time her shift ended at 7 that evening, she had heard nothing back from the security office, nothing from the federal team, nothing from Raymond. The hospital was the same as it always was, busy, slightly overworked, humming with the specific energy of an institution that never fully stops. She changed out of her scrubs. She got in her car. She drove home. And if she was aware as she drove that the next 48 hours were going to require everything she had, not the part of her that was visible, not the nurse, but the part of her that nobody here had ever seen, she gave no outward sign of it. Her hands were steady on the wheel. Her face was composed. The radio played something soft and entirely forgettable. The woman nobody saw drove home through the dark. And in the east corridor of Bethesda Regional Medical Center, the emergency exit alarm continued its quiet, undiscovered delay, blinking its small green ready light into an empty hall, waiting for the moment when what had been ignored would become impossible to overlook. The 4 words hit the lobby like a pressure wave. "Where is Agent Cole?" Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The 2 Black Hawk helicopters were still winding down on the rooftop, their rotors cutting slower and slower through the cold morning air. And Special Agent Thomas Garrett was standing in the center of Bethesda Regional's main corridor, with 6 agents flanking him, and his eyes moving across every face in that hallway like a man running a rapid threat assessment on every single person he saw. He was not raising his voice. He did not need to. The authority in those 4 words had already emptied the room of everything except shock and the specific, suffocating silence that follows a moment nobody was prepared for. Raymond Hull was the first person to speak, which was, Meredith would later reflect, entirely predictable. "I'm Dr. Raymond Hull, Chief of Staff," he said, stepping forward with the reflexive confidence of a man whose first response to any situation was to establish his own importance within it. He extended his hand. "Whatever you need, I'm the person you want to—" "I didn't ask for the Chief of Staff," Garrett said. He did not take Raymond's hand. He looked past him. "I asked for Agent Cole. Where is she?" The she landed like a detonation in the middle of that hallway. Sandra, standing near the nurse's station, watched Raymond's extended hand hang in the air for 1 full second before he slowly lowered it. She had worked at Bethesda for 19 years. She had never seen Raymond Hull publicly ignored. She had never seen his hand not taken. The expression that crossed his face in that moment was something she would describe later to her sister on the phone as the look of a man who has just been informed, without words, that everything he thought he knew about a situation was wrong. It was 6:47 in the morning. Garrett's second in command, a sharp-featured woman named Agent Diana Reyes, was already moving toward the nurse's station with a tablet in her hand. She pulled up a photo, a staff ID photo, Standard issue, the kind taken under fluorescent lights that flattened everyone into a version of themselves that was slightly less than real. And she turned the screen towards Sandra. "Meredith Cole," she said. "She's on the morning shift. Where is she right now?" Sandra opened her mouth, closed it. She was just... I saw her clock in at 7. She should be on the East Wing doing her med rounds." "East Wing," Reyes said, and she was already turning, already moving, already pressing 2 fingers to the earpiece she was wearing and speaking in the low, clipped cadence of someone transmitting information that mattered. Raymond stepped into Garrett's path. It was a bold move, a desperate one. "Agent Garrett," he said, and his voice had acquired a particular tightness, the vocal equivalent of a man holding something together with both hands. "I've been fully briefed on the security protocols for this visit. I've been the primary administrative contact for your advanced team for the past week. If there's a situation developing, I need to be in that conversation." Garrett looked at him then, not past him, at him. It was the first time since entering the building that the agent had given Raymond his full attention. And somehow, that was worse than being ignored, because the attention was entirely clinical and entirely brief. "Doctor," Garrett said, "right now the only conversation that matters is the one I'm about to have with your nurse. Please step back." The please was not a courtesy. It was a warning delivered in the clothing of a courtesy, and Raymond Hall, whatever his other failings, was not a stupid man. He stepped back. Down the east corridor, Meredith was standing at the medication cart outside room 408, comparing the dispensing log to the physician's order on her tablet with the methodical focus that was her professional signature. She heard the footsteps before she saw anyone. 2 sets, moving fast, coordinated, the specific rhythm of people who had been trained to cover ground quickly without making it look like running. She looked up. Agent Reyes came around the corner first, and behind her was a younger male agent whose name Meredith would later learn was Kowalski. Reyes was looking directly at her, the way people look at someone when they already know exactly who they're looking at and have known for longer than the other person realizes. "Meredith Cole," Reyes said. It wasn't a question. Meredith set down her tablet. "Yes. We need you to come with us." The medication cart was still open. There were 3 patients on this corridor who were due for their 8 o'clock medications. Meredith looked at the cart, then looked at Reyes. And the calculation she was making was not the one most people would have made in that moment, which would have been some variation of, what is happening and why me, and am I in trouble? The calculation she was making was practical, precise, and completed in approximately 4 seconds. "I need to close this cart and radio the charge nurse to cover my rounds," she said. "That will take 90 seconds. Reyes blinked. It was a micro-expression, barely there, but Meredith caught it. The blink of someone who had just encountered a response they hadn't anticipated. "Okay," Reyes said. 90 seconds. Meredith closed the cart, locked it, keyed her radio, and in a calm, completely professional voice, informed Sandra that she needed coverage on the East Wing rounds for a minimum of 2 hours, and asked Sandra to please document the handoff per protocol. Sandra's response on the radio, a long pause followed by a slightly strangled, "Copy that," told Meredith everything she needed to know about what was currently happening at the nurse's station. She clipped the radio back to her hip. She looked at Reyes. "I'm ready." They walked her back down the east corridor toward the main lobby, and the moment they turned the corner and she saw Garrett standing there with his team arrayed behind him, she also saw Raymond standing off to one side with the particular stillness of a man who had been told to stop moving and was struggling with every cell in his body to comply. His eyes found hers across the lobby, and in them she saw something she had not expected to see. Not anger, not contempt, the two expressions she was most accustomed to receiving from him. What she saw was something rawer than either of those, something that looked almost like fear. Garrett extended his hand. "Ms. Cole," he said, "I'm Special Agent Thomas Garrett, Protective Intelligence Division. We spoke on the phone 8 months ago. You may not remember. I remember, Meredith said, and she took his hand, and something passed between them in that handshake that was not warmth exactly, and not formality exactly, but some third thing, the recognition of two people who occupy the same kind of interior world and rarely encounter someone else who does. You called from a restricted federal line on a Tuesday. You asked me 3 questions about facility vulnerability assessment protocol, and then told me the call was routine. Garrett's mouth moved in something that was almost a smile. It wasn't routine. I know, Meredith said. I've been waiting. Raymond made a sound. It was not a word. It was the involuntary sound of a man whose understanding of a situation has just been restructured against his will. A sound that contained the beginning of a dozen questions he didn't yet know how to form. Everyone in the lobby heard it. Nobody acknowledged it. We have a situation, Garrett said, and his voice had shifted. The public authority voice dropped away, and what replaced it was the voice of someone who was speaking to an equal in a language that cut past ceremony. The advance assessment flagged 2 of the vulnerabilities you documented in your incident reports: the East Corridor exit and the North Service entrance. Both reports were flagged to our intelligence desk through your security coordinator on Saturday. That's why we're here. The alarm delay, Meredith said. The alarm delay and what our team found behind it. He held her gaze. We're going to need to move to a secure briefing. What I'm about to tell you cannot be shared with general staff. Meredith nodded once. She did not look at Raymond. She did not need to. But Raymond was not done. He crossed the lobby in 4 strides, and there was something about the way he moved that had changed. The smooth, managed quality was gone, replaced by something almost frantic. Agent Garrett, he said, and his voice was tight in a way it had never been in any staff meeting, any briefing, any administrative encounter. Whatever is happening here, as chief of staff of this institution, I have both the authority and the responsibility to be present for any security briefing that involves my staff and my facility. I don't know what relationship you have with Nurse Cole, but I will not be sidelined in my own hospital. Garrett turned to look at him, and the look was long and calm and entirely without hostility, which somehow made it more devastating than hostility would have been. Dr. Hall, he said, your incident reports from the past 3 months were reviewed by our advance team. We noted that every concern documented by Ms. Cole was marked as reviewed and resolved by your office. He paused. They were not resolved. The issues she identified were present when our team conducted their independent assessment this morning. In the federal security evaluation of this facility, that is a significant finding. Another pause, shorter, more final. You're welcome to sit in on the administrative debrief scheduled for 10 o'clock. This briefing is not that briefing. The color that left Raymond Hall's face in that moment was so complete and so sudden that Sandra, watching from the nurse's station, actually took a small, involuntary step toward him, the clinical instinct overriding everything else. He didn't collapse, he just diminished somehow. Right there in the lobby of his own hospital, diminished in front of his staff and the federal agents and the woman he had dismissed and ignored and publicly humiliated for 3 years. Meredith finally looked at him, once, briefly, without triumph, without satisfaction, with something that was almost closer to sorrow, not for what was happening to him now, but for what had been true all along that he had simply refused to see. Then she turned and followed Garrett toward the conference room the federal team had commandeered at the end of the North Corridor. The briefing room had been swept. That was the first thing she registered, the particular quality of a space that had been cleared of electronic devices and checked for surveillance. 4 agents were present, including Reyes and Kowalski. A laptop was open on the table, its screen showing a schematic that Meredith recognized immediately as a modified version of Bethesda's structural floor plan, overlaid with color-coded access point markers. 2 of the markers were red. Sit down, Garrett said, and he sat across from her and opened a folder. How much do you know about what we found? Based on what you've told me so far, Meredith said, and what I've observed over the past week, I know the East Corridor exit is the primary concern. The alarm delay creates a 90-second window of unmonitored egress. That's not an accident. A natural mechanical delay would be 10 to 15 seconds at most. 90 seconds is either catastrophic neglect or deliberate modification. Reyes looked up from her tablet. Deliberate modification, she said flatly. Meredith absorbed this without visible reaction. When was the modification made? Maintenance log analysis puts it at approximately 3 weeks ago, Garrett said, consistent with someone who knew the visit was being planned and began preparation in advance of the public announcement. The visit wasn't publicly announced 3 weeks ago, Meredith said. No, Garrett said, it wasn't. The implication settled in the room like something physical. Meredith let it settle. You have an internal source, she said, not a question. A statement, said quietly, without alarm, in the tone of someone naming a fact that changes the size of a problem significantly. We have reason to believe the information about this visit was accessed through hospital administrative channels before the official briefing, Garrett said carefully. We don't have confirmation on the source yet, but you're telling me this, Meredith said. I'm telling you this because your file says you know how to hold sensitive information, Garrett said, and he closed the folder and looked at her directly. All the procedural language gone now, nothing left but the straight, undecorated truth. And because I need someone inside this facility who knows these corridors, knows this staff, and can move through this building without attracting attention. He paused. Which, based on everything I've read about your time here, sounds like something you've been doing for the past 3 years. Meredith looked at the schematic on the laptop, at the 2 red markers, at the floor plan of a building she had walked so many times that she could navigate it with her eyes closed. What's the timeline? She asked. The visit has been moved forward, Garrett said. 48 hours. The number landed in the room and nobody spoke for a moment. 48 hours. The original schedule had given them 6 days. 6 days to find the source, address the compromised access points, and implement a layered security adjustment that didn't announce itself as a security adjustment. 48 hours changed everything. Why moved forward? Meredith asked. Operational decision above my clearance level, Garrett said. What I know is that the visit is happening. The facility has a compromised access point with a suspected internal connection, and I need someone embedded in the daily operation of this hospital who can do 2 things simultaneously. Help us identify the source and monitor the East Corridor without alerting anyone that we're watching it. Meredith was quiet for a moment, not because she was uncertain. She had stopped being uncertain somewhere around the point where she had written her 3rd ignored incident report, and the certainty had only grown since then, quiet and unshakable, the way deep convictions grow. She was quiet because she was making a specific calculation about what the next 48 hours would require of her, running through contingencies, mapping corridors and schedules, and the particular behavioral patterns of the staff she had watched for 3 years. The night maintenance supervisor, she said finally. Garrett looked at her. Excuse me? His name is Gerald Park. He's been on staff for 4 years. He has master key access to all service corridors, including the north entrance. And he was the on-duty supervisor during both of the maintenance windows that overlap with the alarm modification timeline. She paused. He also changed his lunch schedule 3 weeks ago. He used to eat in the break room. Now he eats alone in the east stairwell, near the emergency exit. The silence that followed was a different quality from the previous silences in that room. It was the silence of people recalibrating. Rhea set down her tablet. How do you know his lunch schedule changed? Because I eat late, Meredith said simply. I'm often in the east stairwell at 11:30 because it's quiet and the signal is better for checking my tablet. He was there 3 times in the past 2 weeks. He didn't see me. She paused. People rarely do. Garrett leaned back slowly. He looked at her the way a man looks at something that has just confirmed a judgment he made months ago and is deeply relieved to have been right about. "We need to move on Park before he realizes we're looking at the exit," he said. "Quietly, no arrest, no visible surveillance change. We need him to stay in his routine." He looked at Meredith. "Can you continue your rounds on the East Corridor without any change in your pattern?" "I've been doing the same rounds the same way for 3 years," Meredith said. "Nobody will notice anything different because nothing will be different." "Good." Garrett reached across the table and slid a small device toward her. It was flat, black, smaller than a matchbook. "If Park accesses that exit within the next 24 hours, press this once. It triggers a silent alert to Reyes's earpiece. Do not approach him. Do not change your behavior. Do not let him know you're watching." Meredith picked up the device. She turned it over once in her hand. Then she put it in her scrub pocket alongside her pen and her badge and the small notebook she carried everywhere. And it disappeared among those ordinary objects as naturally as if it belonged there. "One more thing," Garrett said. She looked at him. "The incident reports you filed, the service entrance report and the East Corridor report. The fact that those reports were routed directly to the facility security coordinator rather than through the chief of staff's office, was that deliberate?" Meredith held his gaze. "The routing protocol for a formal incident report allows direct submission to the facility security coordinator," she said. "I followed protocol." Garrett studied her face. "You knew those reports would be buried if they went through Hall." "I followed protocol," she said again, and something in her voice made it clear that this was both the complete answer and the only answer she was going to give. Garrett nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "Welcome back, Agent Cole." The title landed in the briefing room, and nobody in it moved. And Meredith sat with it for exactly 2 seconds. The weight of it, the familiarity of it, the years and distance and silence between who she had been and who she was, sitting in this chair, being compressed into something that felt, unexpectedly, like relief. Then she stood up and straightened her scrubs and picked up her tablet from the table. "I have patients on the East Wing who miss their 8 o'clock medications," she said. "I need to finish my rounds." She walked out of the briefing room and back into the corridor, and she moved the way she always moved, measured, efficient, completely unremarkable. And the small black device in her pocket was the only thing that had changed, and nobody who watched her pass would have known it was there. Down at the nurse's station, Sandra watched her come around the corner and felt something she could not name and would spend the rest of the day trying to. It wasn't surprise exactly. It wasn't fear. It was something closer to what you feel when you realize you have been standing next to something significant for a very long time without ever understanding what you were looking at. "Med cart's ready," Sandra said carefully. "Thank you," Meredith said. She picked up the cart handle. She started down the corridor. "Meredith." Sandra's voice stopped her. Meredith looked back. Sandra was searching for words, which was unusual for a woman who generally had no shortage of them. Is everything?" "Everything is fine," Meredith said. And then, because 3 years of silence between two people who had worked side by side deserved something more honest than fine, she added, "I'll explain what I can, when I can." She looked at Sandra steadily. "Right now, I just need you to trust that I know what I'm doing." Sandra looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once, the same kind of nod that Bill Ferraro had given her in the security office. The nod of someone who has decided that what they're seeing is worth trusting, even if they can't fully explain why. Meredith pushed the med cart forward. The East Corridor stretched ahead of her, familiar and particular and full of its quiet daily life, patience in doorways and the low, persistent hum of the building around her. Somewhere behind her, Raymond Hall was sitting in his office, doing something with his hands that he hadn't done since medical school, which was trying to make the facts in front of him arrange themselves into a story that made sense. Somewhere ahead of her, Gerald Park was 12 hours from the end of his night shift, and in the pocket of her scrubs, the small black device waited without impatience for the moment it would be needed. The woman nobody had seen was watching everything, and the clock had 47 hours and 12 minutes left on it. 47 hours and 12 minutes. That number sat in the back of Meredith's mind the way a heartbeat sits in the chest. Constant, rhythmic, impossible to ignore once you become aware of it. She pushed the medication cart down the east corridor with the same unhurried precision she brought to every morning round, stopping at room 404, room 406, room 408, speaking to each patient with the same warmth she always brought to those brief bedside conversations, checking vitals, confirming dosages, answering questions with patience and clarity. From the outside, nothing had changed. From the inside, every single thing had. The device in her pocket weighed almost nothing. She was acutely aware of it regardless, the way you are aware of a small burn on your hand. Not painful, not debilitating, just present, always present, a reminder of what was real underneath the ordinary surface of the morning. At 8:42, Marcus Webb passed her in the corridor with his laundry cart and gave her the look he had been giving her since the Blackhawks landed. A look that was trying very hard to be casual and failing completely. "You doing okay?" he asked, keeping his voice down in the way that people keep their voices down when they suspect the hallway might be listening. "I'm doing rounds," Meredith said, which was both true and a complete non-answer. And Marcus, who was a perceptive man, understood that this was all he was going to get and nodded and kept moving. She appreciated him for that. She always had. By 9 o'clock, she had completed the East Wing rounds and handed off to the incoming nurse, a young woman named Priya, who had been at Bethesda for 8 months and had the eager, slightly overwhelmed energy of someone who was still learning that competence and confidence were two separate things that developed on entirely different timelines. Priya looked at her with the expression that a lot of people were wearing that morning. The expression of someone who has discovered that a familiar piece of furniture is actually a door, and the door is open, and they have no idea what's on the other side. "Is it true?" Priya asked, her voice barely above a whisper. That the federal agents are here because of you?" "The federal agents are here because of the presidential visit," Meredith said. "That's what you tell anyone who asks." Priya blinked. "Okay," she said, in the voice of someone who had just been given an instruction by a person whose instructions, it was now abundantly clear, were worth following. Meredith handed over the cart and walked back toward the main corridor. Raymond Hull was waiting for her. Not in his office, not at the nurse's station. He was standing in the hallway outside the storage room adjacent to the east stairwell, and the fact that he had positioned himself there rather than in any of the obvious locations told Meredith two things simultaneously: that he had been watching her route and knew where she would pass, and that he did not want to have this conversation where anyone else could observe it. Both of those facts were interesting. Neither of them was comforting. "Cole," he said, and his voice had lost the weaponized authority it usually carried. It was just his voice now, stripped down, and it sounded older than she expected. "I need 5 minutes." She stopped. She looked at him. "I have 8 minutes before I'm expected back at the briefing room," she said. "Say what you need to say." He glanced up and down the corridor. Clear. He looked back at her. "How long?" he asked. How long has this been?" He stopped, reforming the question, because the version he had started with was too close to admitting something he wasn't ready to fully admit. "Garrett called you Agent Cole." "He did. You're not just a nurse." "I am a nurse," Meredith said. "I have been a nurse here for 3 years. My credentials are legitimate. My license is current. Everything I have done in this building in the capacity of a nurse has been exactly what it appeared to be." She paused. "I'm also other things. I have been other things. That's not something I'm able to discuss with you." Raymond absorbed this. She watched him absorb it. Watch the way a man processes a fundamental revision to a story he thought he knew. the way it moves through him in stages, each stage requiring its own separate reckoning. The first stage was something like humiliation. The second was something like anger. And then, she watched this carefully because it mattered, the third stage was something unexpected, something that looked almost like relief. The reports, he said quietly, the ones I dismissed. Yes, if I had acted on them, the exit would have been secured weeks ago, Meredith said, not cruelly, just factually. The alarm delay would have been discovered and corrected before anyone had the opportunity to use it as a vector. She held his gaze. But you didn't, and now we're here. He looked away. His jaw was tight. Is there a threat? A real one? There is a situation that is being managed by people qualified to manage it, she said. That's what I can tell you. What I need from you is to run this hospital exactly as you would run it on any other day. Brief your staff normally. Don't change any protocols visibly. Don't speak about what happened in the lobby this morning to anyone outside the administrative debrief at 10 o'clock. She paused. Can you do that? He looked back at her, and in the long beat of silence that followed, she could see him making a decision. Not a policy decision, not an administrative calculation, but something more personal and more difficult than either of those. Something about who he was going to be in the next 47 hours and what that was going to cost him. Yes, he said, I can do that. Good, she said. She started to move past him. Cole. His voice stopped her again. She turned. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not in 3 years of interactions ranging from dismissal to active condescension. It was an expression of genuine uncertainty, not weakness, something more honest than weakness. I'm sorry, he said, for the briefing room, for all of it. She looked at him for a moment, 3 years of those moments collected in the space between them. The clipboard snatched from her hands, the laughter at the nurse's station, the memos filed and buried, the words, nobody asked for your opinion, said loudly enough for a room full of people to hear. She let herself feel the weight of all of it, just briefly, the way you press a bruise to confirm it's real. Then she let it go. Do your job, she said. That's what matters right now. She walked away and did not look back. The 10 o'clock administrative debrief was a controlled exercise in institutional damage management that Meredith was not present for, but heard about in fragments throughout the rest of the morning. Garrett had apparently been precise and unemotional in his summary of the facility's security deficiencies, citing specific documentation without editorial commentary, which was, by all accounts, somehow worse than if he had been openly critical. The department heads had sat in near total silence. Raymond had asked 2 questions that were, by Marcus's second-hand assessment, noticeably more subdued than any questions Raymond Cole had asked in any meeting in living institutional memory. What mattered to Meredith was not the debrief. What mattered was Gerald Park. At 10:23, she positioned herself at the supply station at the far end of the East Corridor. A legitimate professional position, close enough to the stairwell access to observe without being visible from within it, far enough away to be entirely unremarkable to anyone passing through. She restocked the supply station with methodical, unhurried care, the kind of task that could justify 10 minutes of stationary presence without raising any questions. At 10:31, she heard the stairwell door open. She did not look up immediately. She counted 3 seconds. Then she turned in the natural course of the restocking task, reaching for a different shelf. And in her peripheral vision, she saw Gerald Park standing in the corridor, just outside the stairwell entrance, with his hands still on the door. He was a broad-shouldered man in his mid-50s, with the particular physical bearing of someone who had done physical labor all his life and wore it as a kind of identity. His maintenance uniform was pressed, which she had always noted as slightly unusual for the end of a night shift. He was looking down the corridor in both directions with a specific quality of attention that distinguished someone checking for observation from someone simply looking around. and the distinction, to a trained eye, was unmistakable. His gaze passed over her, moved on. She was already invisible again. She had never stopped being invisible. He stayed in the corridor for 40 seconds, which was too long for someone who was simply transitioning between locations, and too short for someone who was waiting for something that hadn't arrived yet. Then he went back through the stairwell door. Meredith pressed the device once, a single, clean press. Then she put her hand back on the supply shelf and continued restocking. 20 seconds later, her radio clicked twice. Not a voice transmission, just 2 clicks, which was the prearranged signal from Reyes confirming receipt. Meredith did not change her expression or her posture. She finished the supply task, made a notation in her tablet, and walked back toward the nurse's station at her normal pace. At 11 o'clock, Garrett appeared at the edge of the main corridor and made the briefest possible eye contact with her before turning and walking toward the commandeered conference room. She followed 2 minutes later, taking a different route, arriving through the corridor that connected to the north wing rather than the direct approach. They did not walk in together. They never would. For as long as this operation was running, Park accessed the stairwell 29 minutes ahead of his normal end-of-shift departure time, Garrett said, the moment the conference room door closed. Reyes was already at the laptop. Kowalski was standing near the wall with his arms crossed, and the particular contained alertness of someone waiting for permission to move. We had visual confirmation through the stairwell camera. He didn't go to the exit. He stopped on the landing between the second and third floors. Phone? Meredith asked. No visible device, but his hands weren't in his pockets. Garrett looked at her. He was listening. Meredith thought about this for exactly the amount of time it required. He was doing a timing check, she said, not a call. He was standing on that landing to see how long it took for foot traffic to clear the corridor below. He was running the clock on the window. Reyes looked up from the laptop. He's getting ready to move. Not today, Meredith said. Today was reconnaissance. He's confirming the timing still works before he commits to using it. She looked at Garrett, which means the action is planned for within the active visit window. He knows when the president arrives. He's planning something for that specific period. The room absorbed this. Kowalski uncrossed his arms. Reyes set down her tablet in the specific way people set things down when their hands need to be free to think. We have 36 hours, Garrett said. 35 and a half, Meredith said. Garrett looked at her steadily. We could pull him now, take him into federal custody on the access modification alone, close the exit, reassign him, eliminate the variable, and lose everyone above him, Meredith said. Park didn't modify that alarm on his own initiative. He has access. He has motive. He's been passed over for senior facilities director twice in 3 years. There's a grievance file in HR. But he doesn't have the technical knowledge to know that a 90-second delay creates an exploitable window unless someone told him exactly what to create and why. The silence that followed this was significant. You read his HR file, Garrett said. It was not entirely a question. I read everyone's file, Meredith said. 3 years ago, when I first arrived. Garrett held her gaze for a moment, and whatever he was feeling about this information, he kept it entirely to himself. All right, he said. We leave Park in place. We watch the east exit 24 hours from this point. What do you need from us to make that viable? I need my regular schedule undisturbed, she said. No additional agents in the east corridor. No visible change in surveillance posture anywhere in that wing. If Park sees any shift in the environment, he'll know something changed, and he'll abort. She paused. And I need to know what you're not telling me. The room shifted. It was subtle. A fractional change in the quality of attention from Reyes and Kowalski. The kind of shift that told her they had been expecting this question and had been waiting to see when it would arrive. Garrett looked at her. What makes you think there's something I'm not telling you? You moved a presidential visit forward 48 hours because of 2 compromised access points in a contingency facility, she said. That is not a proportionate response to two compromised access points in a contingency facility. Moving the visit forward increases exposure risk, compresses the preparation window, and requires a complete logistical restructuring of the protective detail. She held his gaze without flinching. You moved it forward because something changed in the intelligence picture that made the original timeline more dangerous than the compressed one, which means the threat is not limited to this building. Garrett was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at Reyes, and Reyes gave him a micro nod, and he looked back at Meredith. The intelligence picture, he said carefully, includes a second location, a second facility on the original visit route that was flagged 22 hours ago. We have reason to believe Bethesda was not the primary target. It was the secondary. Meredith's entire understanding of the past 48 hours reorganized itself in the span of approximately 2 seconds. Someone wanted the visit rerouted here, she said. The protective detail standard protocol, when a primary venue is compromised, is to move to the designated contingency facility, Garrett said. Bethesda Regional is the designated contingency facility for this visit. If the primary location becomes untenable, the president comes here. He paused. Someone has been preparing for that contingency specifically, which means they intended to create a situation that would trigger the rerouting. They're not trying to stop the visit, Meredith said. They're trying to redirect it into a facility with a compromised exit, Garrett said, and a maintenance supervisor who knows the timing. The weight of it settled in the room like something solid. Meredith looked at the schematic on the laptop, the 2 red markers, and now both of them looked different. Not like isolated failures, but like the 2 endpoints of a line that someone had drawn very carefully from a distance over a period of weeks in a building full of people who had been too busy looking at each other to notice what was being drawn around them. How close is the primary location situation? She asked. It's been contained, Garrett said. The rerouting is not going to be triggered. The protective detail knows to hold position regardless of what happens at the primary site. He paused. But Park doesn't know that. Whoever is coordinating Park doesn't know that. They are still operating on the assumption that the rerouting will happen. Meredith understood immediately. They're going to activate him. We believe so, within the visit window, which starts in 34 hours. Garrett leaned forward. When they activate him, we need to know who makes contact. That is the thread. Park is not the operation. Park is the thread that leads to the operation. You need him to receive the activation contact, Meredith said, and you need to intercept it. We need to intercept it without him knowing we've intercepted it, Garrett said, which means he needs to receive it in a location where we can observe without being observed. He looked at her with an expression that contained both the ask and the acknowledgement of what the ask required. The east stairwell landing, where he was this morning. Meredith was quiet for 3 full seconds. She was running the logistics, not the emotional logistics, but the operational ones, the ones that required her to be in a specific place at a specific time with full situational awareness and 0 visible footprint, in a building she knew entirely, among people she had watched for 3 years, in a role that nobody here except one man with silver hair and a federal badge had ever known she could occupy. I can be on the 2nd floor landing by 11:55 each day without it reading as unusual, she said. My late lunch window is established. I've been using that stairwell for a year. Park has seen me there. I'm furniture to him. She looked at Garrett. If contact happens during that window, I'll be positioned to observe. You're not equipped for a surveillance operation, Reyes said. Not critically, practically. The voice of someone assessing a logistical constraint. No, Meredith agreed, but I'm equipped for something better. She looked at Reyes directly. I'm equipped to be invisible, and in this building, right now, that's worth more than any equipment you can give me. Reyes looked at Garrett. Garrett looked at Meredith. There was a moment between them that was not about procedure, not about authorization, not about any of the structures that normally govern what happened in rooms like this. It was simply two people assessing each other's capacity for the truth and finding it sufficient. 11:55, Garrett said, every day until the window closes. You see anything, you press the device twice. 2 presses means visual contact, not a solo press. Can you hold that distinction under pressure? I've held harder distinctions under more pressure, Meredith said simply, and the way she said it closed the subject without opening any others. She left the conference room at 11:22. She walked back to the main corridor, stopped at the nurse's station to check the board, answered 2 questions from Priya about a patient's discharge paperwork, and accepted the cup of coffee that Marcus silently extended toward her from behind his cart with the wordless generosity of a man who had no idea what she was carrying, but understood she was carrying something. She drank the coffee at the station. She updated 2 charts. She looked entirely like herself, the quiet nurse, the one people looked past, the one who had occupied this building for 3 years as furniture, as background, as the person nobody thought to watch. At 11:53, she picked up her tablet and walked toward the east stairwell. At 11:54, she pushed open the stairwell door and started up the stairs. At 11:55, she reached the second-floor landing. Gerald Park was already there, and he was not alone. Her hand was still on the stair rail when she saw them. Gerald Park stood on the landing with his back half-turned, his shoulders carrying the particular tension of a man mid-conversation who has just registered an intrusion. The person facing him was shorter, wearing a white coat, and in the single compressed second before either of them fully turned toward her, Meredith's mind processed the white coat and the build and the posture and the specific way this person held their body with the forward lean of someone accustomed to speaking with authority in institutional spaces. And she knew, with the cold certainty of a diagnosis delivered before the test results come back, exactly who it was. It was Dr. Linda Marsh, the hospital's director of facilities operations, a woman Meredith had sat across from in 12 staff meetings over 3 years, a woman who had signed off on every maintenance protocol, every access key issuance, every infrastructure report that crossed the facilities department's desk, a woman who had technically been in the chain of command above Gerald Park for every single day of his employment at Bethesda. The realization did not arrive slowly, it detonated. Meredith did the only thing she could do, the only thing that made sense given who she was in this building and what that meant to the 2 people on this landing. She looked up from her tablet with the mild, slightly preoccupied expression of someone whose attention is divided between the screen in her hand and the stairs in front of her. And she said, in a voice that was completely, effortlessly ordinary, "Oh, sorry, didn't realize anyone was up here. Dr. Marsh, Gerald." She said their names the way you say the names of people you see every week and think nothing about. Just names, just acknowledgement, just a nurse who had wandered into a stairwell during her break and was mildly inconvenienced by the presence of other people in her quiet space. Park's reaction was the one she needed to read, and she read it without looking at him directly, catching it in her peripheral vision the way she caught everything. The fractional freeze, the micro-tightening across his shoulders, and then the deliberate, slightly too smooth relaxation that followed. The physical equivalent of someone hitting a reset button and hoping nobody noticed the lag. "Cole," he said, the flatness of it, the just a little too neutral tone. Linda Marsh, on the other hand, reacted with the practiced ease of someone who had been performing normalcy for long enough that it had become genuinely natural. She turned toward Meredith with the full body openness of a person who has nothing to hide and smiled with the specific warmth of a senior staff member acknowledging a junior one. "Meredith," she said, hiding from the chaos downstairs. "Something like that," Meredith said, and she almost smiled, and she let the moment be exactly as unremarkable as it needed to be. "I'll find somewhere else," Sorry to interrupt. She turned and went back down the stairs the way she had come, moving at the pace of someone who was mildly embarrassed about interrupting a private conversation and not at all alarmed. And she did not press the device until she was through the stairwell door and 8 steps into the corridor with the door fully closed behind her. 2 presses. 2 clean, deliberate presses. Then she kept walking. East corridor, med station, tablet up, completely invisible. Her heart was doing something it very rarely did, running fast. Not from fear exactly, from the specific physiological response to a situation that has just expanded beyond its previous boundaries in a way that requires immediate recalibration and will not wait for a convenient moment to do it. Linda Marsh, 43 years old, facilities director for 6 years, access to every maintenance log, every key issuance record, every infrastructure document in the building. Access, therefore, to the specific technical knowledge required to know that a 90-second alarm delay would create an exploitable window. Access to Gerald Park in every professional capacity that would make their regular contact completely unremarkable to anyone who happened to observe it. And Meredith now understood the answer to the question that had been sitting unresolved since the morning briefing. The internal source who had known about the presidential visit before the public announcement. The person with administrative access to the interagency coordination correspondence that had come through the hospital's compliance office. The person who would have seen Janet Cho's careful, flagged emails about the federal access requests for floor plans and staff rosters and infrastructure documentation. The person who, unlike Raymond Hall, had understood immediately what those requests meant and had begun preparing. The radio on her hip clicked once. Then Garrett's voice, low and controlled. "We need you at the station, now." She was there in 90 seconds. Garrett was standing inside the commandeered conference room with Reyes and Kowalski and 2 additional agents she hadn't seen before, both of whom had the focused stillness of people who had just been pulled into an active situation and were waiting for the full picture to arrive. Garrett's expression had changed, not dramatically, but in the specific way that a face changes when a calculation has been completed and the result is both expected and worse than hoped. "Marsh," Meredith said before he could speak. "You recognized her," Garrett said. "I worked with her for 3 years." "We didn't have her in the picture until 4 minutes ago," Garrett said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite self-recrimination, but was adjacent to it. The advanced team ran the standard background checks on department head-level staff. Her file was clean, no flags. "Her file would be clean," Meredith said. "She's been here 6 years. She knows how to keep a file clean. She controls the documentation for her own department." She paused. "Who does the money connect to?" Reyes looked up from the laptop. "We're running financials now. It'll take time we don't have in the volume we need." "We have 22 hours, Garrett said. "The visit window opens at 0900 tomorrow." He looked at Meredith. "Walk me through what you saw on that landing, every detail." She did. She walked him through it with the precise, sequential clarity that was her professional signature, the same quality she brought to a patient assessment, the same quality she had brought to every incident report she had ever written in this building. Start with what was observable. Distinguish it from what was inferred. Flag the inference separately and label it as such. Park's shoulder tension, Marsh's calibrated warmth, the specific way Park had said her name with the flatness of someone managing a sudden threat, the way Marsh had smiled with her whole body, not just her face, which was a behavioral tell for someone who had extensive practice in social performance and deployed it reflexively under pressure. Garrett listened without interrupting, which was the mark of a man who understood that the most valuable thing he could do in this moment was not speak. When she finished, he said, "Did you get a read on whether they had completed the contact or if you interrupted it mid-exchange?" Meredith thought about the angle of Park's body when she had entered the landing. The fact that he'd been half-turned, The specific quality of the freeze when she appeared, not the freeze of someone caught in the middle of speaking, but the freeze of someone who had just received information and was processing it. "I think the exchange was complete," she said, "or nearly complete. He had already received what she came to give him." "Which means he has his instructions," Garrett said. "Which means he's going to move tonight or early tomorrow," Meredith said, "before the visit window opens. He'll want to confirm the exit is ready before the timeline compresses any further." Garrett turned to Kowalski. "I want eyes on Park from this moment until we move. Not visible, not even close to visible." Kowalski nodded and was gone before the sentence fully landed. Garrett turned to the two new agents. "Marsh does not leave this building without a tail. She cannot know she's being watched. She makes any communication, phone, in person, anything, I want it logged." They moved. The room was down to Garrett, Reyes, and Meredith. "There's something else," Meredith said. Garrett looked at her. "On that landing, Marsh called me Meredith." She let that sit for a beat. "In 3 years, she has never once called me by my first name. She calls nurses by their last name. She calls everyone below department head level by their last name. It's a consistent behavioral pattern. I've observed it across dozens of interactions." She paused. "She called me Meredith because she needed the moment to feel warm, familiar. She needed me to feel seen and not threatened. She was managing me the same way she was managing Park, with calibrated warmth and deliberate performance." Another pause. "Which means she saw me as a variable that required management. Which means she knows something about me that the standard Bethesda staff file doesn't contain." The silence in the room had a new quality to it now. "She knows who you are," Reyes said quietly. "She knows something," Meredith said, "enough to know that my presence on that landing was not an accident she could afford to dismiss." Garrett was very still. "If Marsh knows your background, she may have known since before this morning, since before the helicopters." "Since before the helicopters," Meredith agreed. "Which means she has been managing me as a known variable throughout this entire operation." The implications of this moved through the room like a change in air pressure. If Marsh had known about Meredith, had known or suspected, or been told by whoever was above her in the chain, then every interaction in this building for the past 3 years had a second layer, a layer that ran beneath the surface of the ordinary institutional life like a current beneath still water. Every dismissal Meredith had experienced, every ignored report, every moment of institutional invisibility. Had any of it been manufactured? Had any of it been managed, not by Raymond's oblivious condescension, but by someone with a specific interest in keeping Meredith exactly where she was, unheard, unheeded, and unable to escalate? "Raymond," Meredith said suddenly. Garrett's eyes sharpened. "What about him?" "My reports went through Raymond's office, all of them. Every incident report, every memo, every flag concern. They went to Raymond and they were buried." She was thinking out loud now, the way she never usually allowed herself to think in the presence of other people, because thinking out loud meant showing the process, and showing the process meant being vulnerable to interruption. But Garrett and Reyes were not those people. "Raymond buried them because he genuinely dismissed them. I believe that. I've watched him for 3 years, and his contempt for my input was never performative. It was real." She paused. "But who made sure the reports went to Raymond in the first place? The routing protocol I followed for 3 years, the standard protocol that sent everything through the Chief of Staff's office. Who established that protocol?" Reyes was already at the laptop. Her fingers moved. She pulled up a document. She looked at it. She looked up at Meredith. "The current incident report routing protocol was established 14 months ago," she said. "Prior to that, formal incident reports were routed directly to the security coordinator." A pause. "The protocol was changed by a joint administrative order signed by the Chief of Staff and the Director of Facilities Operations, Raymond Hull and Linda Marsh." Meredith sat with that for exactly 5 seconds. She changed the routing to ensure my reports went somewhere she knew they would be ignored, she said. Raymond was the firewall. He wasn't a collaborator. He was a tool. She looked at Garrett. Which means she's been running this operation from inside this building for over a year, possibly longer. Garrett stood up. He moved to the door, opened it, looked into the corridor for a brief confirming scan, and closed it again. When he turned back, his expression had the quality of a man who has just added up a column of numbers and arrived at a sum that is both correct and alarming. "We need to bring Raymond into this," he said. "Not the full picture, but enough." "No," Meredith said. Garrett looked at her. "Raymond cannot perform innocence," she said. "He's a man who wears his emotional state on his face, whether he wants to or not. If we tell him Marsh is a suspect, he will look at her differently the next time he sees her, and she will know immediately that the picture has changed." She held Garrett's gaze. "Right now she thinks I was an accidental interruption she successfully managed. She thinks Park completed the handoff before I arrived. She thinks her timing is intact. We cannot give her any reason to reconsider any of those assumptions." Garrett held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said, "You're right. Just that. 2 words, no qualification. The particular verbal economy of a man who respected correct thinking too much to dilute it with unnecessary language." At 2:14 in the afternoon, Kowalski's voice came through Garrett's earpiece with a single piece of information that shifted everything again. Meredith was still in the conference room when Garrett turned to her with the expression of someone delivering news that they had hoped would not arrive quite this quickly. "Park just accessed the maintenance storage room on the sublevel," he said. "He checked out 2 items from the emergency equipment locker, a portable signal jammer and a secondary key fob for the east exit maglock." Meredith stood up. "He's not waiting until tonight. Kowalski has eyes on him. He's moving toward the east stairwell now." The timing collapsed from hours to minutes in a single breath. This was the moment Meredith had been running calculations toward since the morning briefing, since the briefing room before that, since 3 years of quietly watching a building that she had always understood was more complicated than it appeared. And now it was here, arriving not in the controlled, prepared manner of an operation with adequate lead time, but in the sudden, compressed urgency of a situation that had decided not to wait for anyone's schedule. "I need to be in that corridor," she said. "Absolutely not," Garrett said. "If Park activates the jammer, we lose communication. If Marsh has eyes on that corridor, your presence there—" "My presence there is normal," Meredith said. "Park has seen me in that corridor every day for 3 years. My absence would be notable. My presence is furniture." She looked at him with the steadiness of someone who has already made a decision and is simply waiting for the conversation to catch up to it. "You need someone in that corridor who can see what's happening and relay it in real time before the jammer cuts your communications. I am the only person in this building who can do that without changing the operational picture." Garrett looked at Reyes. Reyes looked back at him with an expression that said she agreed with Meredith and found that agreement slightly uncomfortable. Garrett looked back at Meredith. "The moment you see the jammer activate, you get out of that corridor," he said. "You do not engage Park. You do not intercept him. You are eyes only, and you move the second it becomes anything more than observation." "Understood," she said. She was out the door in 6 steps. The east corridor had its normal afternoon quality, the low, persistent hum of the building's systems, the occasional sound of a door, the particular quality of institutional air that never fully changed regardless of what was happening inside it. Meredith walked it the way she had walked it 10,000 times, tablet in hand, pace measured, nothing in her face or her body that was not entirely consistent with a nurse proceeding between tasks on a regular afternoon. She passed room 404, room 406. She reached the supply station at the end of the corridor and stopped there, opened the cabinet and began, with complete composure, to check the stock of gauze pads. She heard the stairwell door. She did not look up. Park came into the corridor moving with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man who has decided the only way to do something dangerous in plain sight is to look as though he belongs there, which he did because he worked here. And the cognitive dissonance of that thought, that he genuinely belonged here and was using that belonging as cover for something that was the opposite of belonging, was something Meredith filed away and felt later. She heard him reach the east exit. She heard him pause. She heard the specific sound of a key fob against a magnetic lock reader, a sound she knew with the precision of 3 years of working in proximity to it. She looked up. Park was standing at the east exit with his back to her. His right hand was at the lock panel. In his left hand, at his side, was the jammer, a flat black rectangular device barely larger than a deck of cards, its activation button on the top face, not yet pressed. He was doing the final check, the last confirmation before the action. He had not yet seen her, and she could not know how many seconds she had before he turned. She pressed her radio transmission button 3 times, the unscheduled signal she and Garrett had established for immediate status, and said 2 words at normal conversational volume, the volume of a nurse speaking to a colleague down the hall, the volume of someone whose words would carry just far enough and no further. "He's here." Park turned. Their eyes met across the corridor, and in the 3 seconds that followed, in the compressed, airless, absolute stillness of 2 people who have just understood each other completely for the first time, Meredith watched Gerald Park go through every stage of a decision in real time. The calculation of whether she was what she appeared to be. The memory of every time he had looked past her in this building and seen nothing. The wrestling match between 3 years of confirmed invisibility and the cold new voice in the back of his mind saying that something about this moment was wrong, that she was standing too still, that her eyes were too steady, that a nurse who had just stumbled onto something she didn't understand would look different than this. His thumb moved toward the jammer button. "Gerald," Meredith said, and her voice was the voice she used with patience. Calm, direct, present. "Don't." He pressed it. The corridor went electronically silent. And then the stairwell door at the far end burst open, and Kowalski came through it at full speed. And the door behind Meredith opened simultaneously with Reyes and the 2 new agents behind her. And Gerald Park stood between them with the jammer in one hand and the key fob in the other, and nowhere to go. And he looked at Meredith in the middle of it all with the expression of a man who had just understood something he was going to spend a very long time thinking about. She walked toward the agents. She walked past Park without stopping. She did not look at him again. There was nothing more for her to read there. At the far end of the corridor, her radio came back to life as the jammer was secured, and Garrett's voice was in her ear immediately. "Marsh is in motion. She just left her office. North corridor, heading for the service entrance." A half-beat pause. "She knows." Meredith was already moving. The north corridor was the longest straightaway in the building. Meredith knew that. She had walked it more times than she could count, had calculated its length against her stride on her 2nd week at Bethesda, the way she calculated all distances in all buildings she occupied, automatically, without ceremony, the way other people calculated the price of groceries or the minutes until a meeting. From the east corridor junction to the north service entrance was 214 feet. At a walk, that was approximately 45 seconds. At the pace Linda Marsh was moving, based on Garrett's voice in her ear saying, "North corridor heading for the service entrance," she had maybe 60 seconds before Marsh reached the door. Meredith did not run. Running in a hospital corridor draws attention, draws questions, draws exactly the kind of institutional response that would announce to everyone within earshot that something was wrong. Instead, she turned the corner into the north corridor, and she saw Marsh immediately. White coat, confident stride, a bag on her shoulder that had not been on her shoulder this morning. The specific bag of a person who has decided they are not coming back and has taken what they need before leaving. Marsh was 20 feet from the service entrance door. Meredith was 60 feet behind her. "Dr. Marsh," she said. Her voice was calm, completely, absolutely calm. The voice then Marsh turned, and her face did the thing it had done on the landing in the stairwell, assembling itself into warmth and openness with the practiced speed of someone who had been performing this particular expression for a very long time. "Meredith," she said, "same warmth as before, same full-body openness, same deployment of the first name as a weapon of familiarity. I know where you were going," Meredith said. She was walking toward her at the same steady pace, not aggressive, not hurried, just closing the distance with the absolute certainty of someone who intends to finish what they've started. "And I know what's in the bag. And I know about the routing protocol you changed 14 months ago. And I know about Gerald. And I know why you needed my reports to disappear." The warmth on Marsh's face did not collapse. It shifted, reconfigured. What replaced it was something that was almost more unsettling than hostility would have been. A kind of cool assessment, the expression of a person removing a mask, not in defeat, but in the deliberate choice to stop expending energy on a performance that has become unnecessary. "You're good," she said. The tone was almost appreciative. Almost. "I knew you were good. I told them you were a problem from the beginning." She tilted her head slightly. "They said you were contained, that nobody listened to you here, that 3 years of institutional invisibility would be enough." "They were wrong," Meredith said. "Yes," Marsh said, "they were." And then, in a movement that was faster than Meredith anticipated and spoke of physical training that the facilities director title had never suggested, Marsh's hand went into the bag. Meredith closed the remaining distance in 3 steps. What happened in the next 4 seconds was not elegant. It was not the choreographed precision of a training exercise. It was 2 women in a hospital corridor, one of whom had prepared for this moment, and one of whom had prepared for a different version of it. And the difference between those 2 preparations mattered enormously. Meredith got her hand on the bag strap before Marsh could extract whatever was inside it. Marsh pulled. Meredith pulled back and used the momentum, turning Marsh's own force against the direction of the door, and the 2 of them were still locked in that taut, straining standoff when the north corridor filled with the sound of running feet from both directions simultaneously. Reyes came from the east end. The exterior agent came through the service entrance from the other side. Marsh looked at the agent coming through the door she had been trying to reach, and for the first time since she had turned around, the composure left her face entirely. Not in a dramatic way, in the quiet, final way of something structural giving way. Not a collapse, just a settling, the way a building settles when the last load-bearing tension is released. Her hand came out of the bag. Empty. Reyes was there in 2 more seconds, and the bag was secured, and Marsh's hands were being guided behind her with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times. And the north corridor of Bethesda Regional Medical Center, which had seen decades of ordinary institutional life, held this extraordinary moment with the same acoustic indifference it brought to everything else. Meredith stepped back. She straightened her scrubs. She looked at Linda Marsh, who was looking back at her with the expression of a woman at the end of a very long calculation. And she said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying, and Marsh would have understood that. It was 2:47 in the afternoon. Garrett reached her 30 seconds later, coming around the corner at the kind of controlled, fast pace that his training had made instinctive. And he took in the scene with a single, sweeping assessment, and then looked at Meredith and said, "Are you injured?" "No," she said. He looked at her for one more second with an expression that was not professional and not operational, and not the careful, neutral face of a federal agent managing an active situation. It was something more personal than any of those things. The expression of a man who had read a file 8 months ago and made a judgment call based on it, and had just watched that judgment call prove itself correct in the most direct possible way. Then the professional face came back, and he turned toward Reyes, and the work continued. They took Marsh out through the service entrance, which had a specific quality of rightness to it that Meredith noted without dwelling on. The door she had been trying to escape through became the door she left through, and the irony of that was the kind the universe occasionally produces without commentary, leaving the meaning for whoever was paying attention. Meredith stood in the corridor alone for approximately 45 seconds. Then she walked back toward the main wing. At 3:15, Garrett called her back to the conference room for what he described as a debrief, and what turned out to be something more layered than that word suggested. The room had acquired additional personnel, a man in a suit whose name she was given and immediately understood she was not expected to use, who sat at the end of the table and said very little, and wrote things on a notepad with the focused efficiency of someone who had arrived to assess rather than participate. Reyes was there. Two of the earlier agents were there. The atmosphere had the particular quality of a room in which the immediate crisis has passed and the longer-term questions are beginning to surface. Park is in federal custody, Garrett said. Marsh is in federal custody. The bag contained a burner phone with 3 contacts, all foreign exchange numbers currently being traced, and a physical key override for the east exit maglock that bypasses the electronic system entirely. If she had gotten through that door, she would have been in the parking structure with a vehicle we found registered to a shell company, license plates already switched. He looked at Meredith. You had maybe 40 seconds on her. I know, Meredith said. The jammer Park had would have cut our communication systems for approximately 4 minutes, Garrett continued. During a 4-minute blackout window with Marsh running the exit and Park opening the service corridor from the inside simultaneously, we would have had a significant operational gap. He paused. You closed both of those gaps. The man at the end of the table wrote something. The visit is proceeding on schedule tomorrow, Garrett said. The facility has been cleared. The access points are secured. The protective detail has been fully briefed on the updated assessment. He looked at her steadily. Bethesda Regional is safe. Meredith nodded once. There will be formal reporting requirements, Garrett said. Your involvement will be documented at the classification level consistent with your previous service record. For the purposes of this hospital's administrative and public record, what happened today will be described as a federal security operation conducted in preparation for a presidential visit, which is entirely accurate. A pause. Your name will not appear in any document accessible to the hospital's general administration. That's fine, Meredith said. The man at the end of the table looked up for the first time. His gaze was assessing in the specific way of someone who has read a file and is now comparing the file to the person sitting in front of him. Whatever comparison he was making, he kept the result to himself. He looked back down at his notepad. Reyes said, "For what it's worth," and then stopped, because Reyes was not a person who said, "For what it's worth," without being certain what she wanted to follow it with, and she was clearly still deciding. Then she finished the sentence. I've run advanced assessments on 47 facilities in 6 years. The documentation you produced on those access points was the most precise, independent vulnerability analysis I've seen from a non-federal source. And you were working with no equipment, no authorization, and no support. She held Meredith's gaze. That's a significant thing. Thank you, Meredith said, and meant it. Quietly, without performance, in the voice of someone who had waited a long time for something to be acknowledged and found that the acknowledgement, when it arrived, was smaller and more simply important than they had imagined it would be. She left the conference room at 3:41. She had a 4 o'clock med round on the 3rd floor. She was not going to miss it. Raymond Hall was waiting outside the conference room door. Of course he was. He had the look of a man who had spent the last several hours in a state of suspended personal reckoning, and he rose from the chair he'd been sitting in with a slightly stiff movement of someone who has been still for too long because moving felt presumptuous. Cole, he said. Dr. Hall, she said. She did not stop walking, but she slowed slightly, enough to allow the conversation, without making it into something it didn't need to be. He fell into step beside her. "Marsh," he said. "I've been—" He stopped, started again. "The routing protocol, the one she and I signed 14 months ago. She told me it was a liability issue. That direct submission to security was creating a documentation gap in the administrative record. I signed it because it sounded plausible and because I trusted—" He stopped again. His voice had the quality of a man excavating something from inside himself that had been buried under years of accumulated self-image. "I didn't read it carefully enough. I signed something I should have read more carefully." "Yes," Meredith said simply. "And the reports," he said, "the ones you submitted, I dismissed them because I had decided you were someone whose input wasn't worth—" He couldn't finish that sentence either. She didn't help him finish it. "I was wrong," he said, "about the reports and about you, and I don't know if—" He was searching for something, and it struck her that what he was searching for was not the right words, but the honest ones, which were harder. "I don't know if I can explain why I was the way I was, in a way that doesn't just sound like an excuse." "You can't," Meredith said, not unkindly, "but that's not what matters right now." He looked at her. "What matters right now?" She stopped walking. She turned to face him fully, because this was a moment that deserved that, and she was done giving moments less than they deserved. "There are 53 patients in this building," she said. "Tomorrow morning, the President of the United States is going to be in this building, and every one of those patients needs care that doesn't get interrupted by whatever is happening in the administrative tier. What matters right now is that you go back to your office and you run this hospital the way it deserves to be run." She held his gaze. "Can you do that?" Raymond Hall looked at the woman he had dismissed and ignored and publicly humiliated for 3 years. The woman who had just spent 48 hours being the difference between a secured facility and a national catastrophe. And something happened in his face that was not comfortable to witness because it was entirely genuine. His eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with professional composure and everything to do with a man encountering the full scope of his own failures at close range and choosing not to look away from them. "Yes," he said, "I can do that." She nodded once. She turned and walked toward the elevator. The 4th floor was quieter than the lower levels, the way the upper floors of hospitals often were in the late afternoon. The rushed urgency of the morning settled into the steadier rhythm of the midday, patients resting, families visiting in the low-voiced way of people who understood they were in a shared space, machines doing their quiet, patient work. Meredith pushed her medication cart down the corridor and stopped at each room the way she always did. And in each room she was exactly who she had always been: present, careful, warm, competent, the nurse who remembered the small details that mattered, who spoke to patients like people rather than conditions, who made the institutional feel, if only for a few minutes, like something human. In room 412, an elderly man named Harold, who had been on this floor for 9 days with a hip fracture, and the particular loneliness of someone whose family visited infrequently, looked up when she came in and said, "You're late." 4 minutes, she said, checking his chart. 4 minutes is 4 minutes, Harold said, but he was smiling when he said it, the smile of someone who teases people they trust. "You look different today." Meredith looked up from the chart. "Different how?" Harold studied her with the unhurried assessment that elderly people sometimes deploy, the kind that has stopped caring about social courtesy and gone straight to observation. "Not different on the outside," he said. "Same as always on the outside. Different in the eyes." He tilted his head, like something got resolved. She looked at him for a moment. "Something did," she said. "Good," Harold said simply, and accepted his medication with the dignity of a man who asked no more questions than the situation required. At 5:38, as her shift wound toward its end, Sandra caught her at the nurse's station for the second time that day. But this time, Sandra's expression had none of the cautious uncertainty it had carried in the morning. It had something else entirely, the specific emotional mixture of a person who has spent a day revising their understanding of something they thought they knew, and arrived at the end of that revision with a feeling that was mostly, unexpectedly, like relief. "Marcus told me they took Marsh out in federal custody," Sandra said, her voice low. "I can't confirm or discuss anything related to today's federal operation," Meredith said. "Right," Sandra said. "Right." She was quiet for a moment. Then, 3 years, she said. "I've worked alongside you for 3 years and She pressed her lips together. "I told you there was no first time for everything. I told you some things were just the way they are." "You did," Meredith said. "I was wrong," Sandra said. "I was completely wrong, and I want to say that out loud." She looked at Meredith with the directness of someone who had decided that this conversation was going to be honest, regardless of how uncomfortable honest was. "You kept trying to make this place safer, and I kept telling you to stop trying, because I had gotten so used to the way things were that I'd stopped believing things could be different." Her voice had acquired a roughness that she was not trying to smooth out. "I'm sorry for that." Meredith looked at her colleague of 3 years, this capable and complicated woman who had operated inside a broken system for so long that she had begun to mistake the system for reality. She felt no triumph. She felt something much quieter and more durable than triumph. The particular satisfaction of a person who has held to what they knew was true for long enough to see the truth confirmed, and found that the confirmation mattered less than the holding. "Buy me a terrible cup of the break room coffee sometime," Meredith said, "and we're even." Sandra laughed. It was a slightly watery laugh, but it was real, and it filled the nurse's station with a warmth that the day, with all its weight and urgency, had not yet managed to produce. "Deal," she said. Meredith clocked out at 6:59. She changed out of her scrubs in the locker room, which was empty at this hour, and she sat on the bench for a moment before putting on her street clothes. And she let herself be still in the way she almost never allowed herself to be still. Fully still, with no task ahead, and no calculation running, and no piece of the environment requiring her attention. Just still, just present in the quiet of an ordinary room at the end of an extraordinary day. Her phone showed one message, a restricted federal number. 4 words. "Good work today, Cole." She looked at those 4 words for a long moment. Then she put her phone in her pocket and finished changing and walked out to the parking lot. The evening air had the particular quality of October air in this part of the country, clean and slightly sharp, the kind of air that makes you aware of being alive in a physical rather than an abstract way. She stood beside her car for a moment before getting in, and she looked at the building she had walked into every morning for 3 years. This building that had dismissed her and ignored her and failed to see her. And she thought about Harold in room 412 saying "different" in the eyes. And she thought about the east exit alarm blinking its small green ready light into an empty corridor 3 years ago when she had first noticed it. And she thought about 2 black helicopters cutting the morning sky and 4 words landing in a lobby like a pressure wave and changing everything. The woman nobody saw, standing in a parking lot in the last of the October light, 41 years old, medium height, brown hair, a face that was easy to look past unless you were paying the right kind of attention. She had been paying the right kind of attention for 3 years. She had written it down. She had handed it over. She had been dismissed and overruled, and publicly humiliated and rerouted and managed from a distance by people who understood enough about her to know she was dangerous, and not enough to know that you cannot contain a person like Meredith Cole by simply making her invisible. Invisibility was not a cage. For Meredith, invisibility had always been something else entirely. It had been the thing she chose, the thing she used, the thing that let her see everything while others saw nothing. Tomorrow morning, the president would arrive at Bethesda Regional Medical Center, a building that was clean, secured, and safe. The access points were locked. The threats were in federal custody. The operation that had been built around an assumption that one quiet nurse in an unremarkable hospital could be kept quiet and unremarkable forever had collapsed completely, the way all operations built on false assumptions eventually collapse. Not with a dramatic explosion, but with the simple, final weight of reality asserting itself. And Meredith Cole would clock in at 6:58, 2 minutes before her shift required, and push her medication cart down the East Corridor and stop at every room and speak to every patient and do every piece of her job with the same precision and warmth she had brought to it every day for 3 years. Because this was also who she was, not the cover, the person. The nurse who remembered Harold's name and Sandra's coffee preference and the 4-minute gap in her timing that Harold had called out with the comfortable authority of someone who had earned the right to tease. Both things were true. They had always both been true. The woman who noticed the alarm delay and the woman who stayed 45 seconds longer in a patient's room because they needed someone to talk to were not separate identities in conflict with each other. They were one person, complete, who had simply been waiting in a place that hadn't known what it had until 2 Black Hawks landed on the roof and a federal agent asked 4 words that rearranged everything. She got in her car. She drove home through the dark. The quiet hero had nothing left to prove, and that, more than anything else, was what made her exactly who she had always been.